I was a teacher fired for poor performance until I exposed the principal's degree mill. But that morning, staring at the termination letter in my trembling hands, I had no idea I was about to uncover something that would destroy him completely. The fluorescent lights in Principal Morrison's office buzzed like angry wasps as he slid the manila folder across his polished desk. My hands shook as I opened it, though not from fear, from pure, crystalline rage that I fought to keep buried beneath a mask of professional composure. The letter bore the school district's official letterhead, each typed word a calculated blow designed to end my 15-year teaching career. Effective immediately. Substandard classroom management. Failure to meet academic benchmarks. The phrases blurred together as my vision tunneled, but I forced myself to read every damning line twice. Morrison leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled, watching me with the cold satisfaction of a man who believed he held all the cards. I had dedicated my life to Hamilton Middle School. 15 years of arriving early, staying late, spending my own money on supplies for students whose families couldn't afford them. 15 years of perfect performance reviews until Morrison arrived 18 months ago. Now suddenly I was incompetent. The irony would have been laughable if it wasn't destroying everything I'd worked for. Morrison's mouth moved in what I assumed were explanations, justifications, perhaps even false sympathy. I stopped listening. Instead, I watched his hands, soft, unmarked by real work, gesture dismissively at the stack of fabricated complaints he'd compiled against me. Behind him, his wall displayed an impressive array of framed degrees and certifications. PhD in Educational Leadership from Westfield University, Masters in Administrative Sciences from Pacific Coast Institute, Bachelor's from somewhere I couldn't read from this angle. Impressive credentials for a man who'd never taught a single class before becoming principal. I nodded at appropriate intervals, signed where directed, and gathered my things with the mechanical precision of someone in shock. But beneath the surface, something darker was crystallizing. As I walked past his credential wall one final time, a detail caught my eye. Something about the formatting of his PhD diploma that seemed off. I filed the observation away and left his office with my dignity intact and my mind already working. The parking lot felt surreal in the afternoon sunlight. Students streamed past me toward waiting buses, their chatter and laughter a stark contrast to the career-ending silence that had just engulfed my life. I sat in my Honda for 20 minutes, engine off, letting the reality settle over me like a shroud. Then I started the car and drove home to begin my research. My home office had always been my sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk inherited from my grandfather, and filing cabinets full of lesson plans accumulated over 15 years. But that evening, I transformed it into something else entirely. A war room. I started with Morrison's background. The internet made stalking surprisingly easy when you knew where to look. LinkedIn provided his employment history, though it was suspiciously sparse before his appointment at Hamilton. Facebook showed a lifestyle that seemed extravagant for an educator's salary. Caribbean vacations, expensive wines, a Lexus that definitely cost more than my annual income. But it was his education credentials that drew me deeper down the rabbit hole. Westfield University, where he'd supposedly earned his PhD, had a professional-looking website. Accredited programs, distinguished faculty, glowing testimonials from successful graduates. I spent 3 hours exploring every page before I found the crack in the facade. A single forum post from 2 years ago, where someone complained about never receiving their diploma from Westfield despite paying full tuition. The thread had been deleted, but Google's cache remembered everything. I leaned back in my chair, fingers drumming against the desktop as pieces began falling into place. Morrison's quick rise through administrative ranks, his expensive lifestyle, his complete lack of actual teaching experience, and now the possibility that his prestigious PhD might be nothing more than expensive paper. I pulled up the school district's website and navigated to Morrison's bio page. There it was in bold print, Dr. James Morrison, PhD Educational Leadership, Westfield University, 2018. The district had trusted those credentials without question, just as they'd trusted his character assassination of me. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Chen, my former colleague and one of the few teachers who'd stood by me during Morrison's campaign against me. She wanted to know how I was holding up, if there was anything she could do. I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back that I was fine, just needed time to process. I wasn't fine, I was furious. But more importantly, I was beginning to see a path forward that would make my termination look like the opening move in a chess game I was about to win. Over the next week, I became a detective. I created multiple fake email accounts and identities to probe Westfield University from different angles. I called their admissions office pretending to be a prospective student. I reached out to supposed faculty members whose names appeared on the website. I even tried to verify Morrison's graduation records through official channels. The deeper I dug, the more obvious it became that Westfield University was an elaborate facade. Phone numbers led to answering services. Faculty profiles used stock photos that appeared on modeling websites. The university's physical address belonged to a strip mall mailbox service in Nevada. Morrison had purchased his PhD from a sophisticated degree mill, and the school district had hired him based on fraudulent credentials. But knowing it and proving it were different challenges entirely. I needed physical evidence, documentation that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. That meant getting access to Morrison's office, his files, his computer. The same office where he'd handed me my termination letter just days ago. The security at Hamilton Middle School was typical for a public building. Cameras at main entrances, locked doors after hours, but plenty of vulnerabilities for someone who knew the building intimately. Teachers had been using the back service entrance for years to avoid the crowded main hallway during class changes. The lock had been broken for months, and the camera covering that door had a convenient blind spot near the dumpsters, where shadows made recognition impossible. I spent 3 nights observing the school's after-hours security patterns. The district employed a single guard who made rounds every 2 hours, spending most of his time in the comfortable security office, watching Netflix on his phone. His schedule was as predictable as the sunrise. On Thursday evening, I parked 6 blocks away and walked to the school through the residential neighborhood behind the building. Black clothing, baseball cap pulled low, latex gloves in my pocket. I felt like a character in a heist movie, and the adrenaline coursing through my veins was intoxicating. The service door opened with a soft click. Hamilton Middle School after dark was a different creature entirely. Shadows stretched down empty hallways, and my footsteps echoed despite my efforts to move silently. The familiar building felt alien and threatening, every corner potentially hiding the security guard or some unforeseen obstacle. Morrison's office was on the 2nd floor, accessible through the main stairwell or the back stairs near the gymnasium. I chose the gym route, knowing that section of the building would be darkest and furthest from the security office. Each step felt like it took an eternity, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain the sound would carry throughout the building. The door to Morrison's office suite was locked, but the administrative area had always been a security weak point. The receptionist's office shared a wall with Morrison's private office, and the connecting door between them had a lock that Sarah Chen had once mentioned was always broken. Teachers occasionally used the receptionist's office to make private phone calls or handle personal business. I knelt beside the outer door, thankful for the lock-picking videos I'd watched obsessively over the past few days. The cheap lock yielded after 5 minutes of careful manipulation, and I was inside the administrative suite. Morrison's private office door was unlocked from this side. His sanctuary, the place where he'd destroyed my career, lay open before me like a tomb waiting to reveal its secrets. I photographed everything systematically. His diplomas hanging on the wall, each one captured in high resolution that would reveal any inconsistencies or alterations. His filing cabinets, which yielded copies of correspondence between Morrison and something called Professional Education Services, a company that apparently provided credential verification and documentation services for a substantial fee. But the real treasure was his computer. Morrison had left his desktop unlocked, a rookie mistake that spoke to his arrogance. His email contained a goldmine of incriminating correspondence. Negotiations with the degree mill over pricing for various credentials. Instructions on how to make his fraudulent diplomas look authentic. Even complaints to customer service when his fake transcripts took too long to arrive. I photographed screen after screen, documenting a systematic fraud that had probably cost the school district hundreds of thousands in salary and benefits based on Morrison's inflated credentials. He'd been living a lie, drawing a salary he hadn't earned, making decisions affecting hundreds of students and dozens of teachers, all while holding fake qualifications that wouldn't pass basic scrutiny. The security guard's footsteps echoed down the hallway outside. I froze, every muscle in my body locked in place as the sound grew closer. My mind raced through escape options, explanations, consequences. Getting caught would mean criminal charges, the destruction of any credibility I might have, and the burial of evidence that could expose Morrison's fraud. The footsteps paused outside the administrative suite. I crouched behind Morrison's desk, holding my breath as the door handle rattled. The security guard was checking locks, following his routine. After what felt like an hour but was probably 30 seconds, the footsteps continued down the hallway toward the other end of the building. I waited another 10 minutes before resuming my work, but the close call had reminded me that I was operating on borrowed time. I copied the most incriminating files to a flash drive, returned Morrison's computer to its previous state, and retraced my steps through the building with paranoid precision. The walk back to my car felt like a victory march. I had enough evidence to destroy Morrison's career and expose the fraud that had cost me my job. But as I drove home through empty suburban streets, I realized that simply revealing the truth wouldn't be enough. Morrison had cost me more than just employment. He'd damaged my reputation, destroyed relationships with colleagues who'd been forced to choose sides, and shattered 15 years of dedication to education. He deserved more than exposure. He deserved to experience the same helpless fury I'd felt sitting in his office, watching my career dissolve based on his lies. I was going to give him exactly that. The next phase of my plan required patience and strategic timing. Simply releasing the evidence would result in Morrison's termination and probable criminal charges, but it would also allow him to disappear quietly, perhaps to resurface at another school district with another set of fraudulent credentials. I wanted him to understand the scope of his exposure, to feel the walls closing around him the same way I'd felt them closing around me. More importantly, I wanted to orchestrate his downfall in a way that would be impossible to ignore or minimize. I began by creating an anonymous email account and sending carefully crafted messages to key people in Morrison's professional network. Not accusations. Those would be dismissed as the ravings of a disgruntled employee. Instead, I sent innocent-seeming questions about his credentials to colleagues at other schools, casual inquiries about his doctoral research, requests for academic papers he'd supposedly published. The responses were telling. Nobody remembered Morrison from graduate school. His supposed dissertation director had never heard of him. The research papers listed on his CV didn't exist in any academic database. While Morrison remained oblivious to the growing web of inquiries surrounding his credentials, I began phase 2, ensuring that when his fraud was exposed, it would be impossible to contain. I researched local education reporters, particularly those who specialized in administrative corruption and fraud. I identified school board members who'd made public statements about academic integrity and credential verification. I found parent advocacy groups who'd been critical of district hiring practices. I even located former students of Westfield University's degree mill who might be willing to speak publicly about their experiences. But the most important target for my eventual revelation was the upcoming school board meeting where Morrison was scheduled to present his annual review and goals for the coming academic year. The meeting was public, broadcast on local cable access, and attended by parents, teachers, and community members who trusted him to lead their children's education. I wanted Morrison to stand before that audience, puffed up with arrogance and self-satisfaction, before learning that his world was about to collapse. 2 weeks before the board meeting, I began the final phase of my psychological campaign. I started leaving subtle signs that Morrison's fraud was being investigated. An anonymous note left on his windshield asking about his time at Westfield. A fake phone message from someone claiming to be from the Department of Education's Credential Verification Office. A manila envelope containing photocopies of degree mill expose articles left in his school mailbox. I watched him from a distance during the few times I had legitimate reasons to be on school property. Picking up personal items, meeting with HR about my termination benefits. Morrison's confident swagger began showing cracks. He looked over his shoulder more often. He snapped at teachers and staff. He started locking his office door religiously and changing his computer passwords weekly. The paranoia was eating at him, but he had no idea how much evidence I'd already gathered or how carefully I'd planned his exposure. 3 days before the school board meeting, I received an unexpected gift. Morrison made a critical mistake. Feeling pressured by the anonymous inquiries about his credentials, he reached out to Professional Education Services to request updated documentation that might pass closer scrutiny. The email exchange, which I monitored through keylogger software I'd installed during my office infiltration, revealed that Morrison was planning to present additional fraudulent credentials at the board meeting to deflect any questions about his qualifications. He was going to double down on his fraud in the most public forum possible. I could hardly contain my satisfaction as I crafted the final elements of my plan. Morrison would present his fake credentials to the school board, the community, and the local media. And then, in front of everyone who trusted him, I would systematically destroy every lie he'd built his career on. The night before the board meeting, I prepared my presentation with the same meticulous attention to detail I'd once brought to lesson planning. Screenshots, documentation, a clear timeline of Morrison's fraud, and contact information for journalists who'd already expressed interest in the story after receiving my anonymous tips. But I also prepared something more personal, a detailed account of how Morrison had systematically targeted me for termination despite my exemplary record, using fabricated complaints and manipulated data to destroy my career. I'd document how his abuse of power had affected not just me, but other teachers who'd been afraid to speak out against his incompetent leadership. Morrison had made this personal when he chose to destroy my career to cover his own inadequacies. Now I was going to return the favor. The Hamilton Middle School library had been converted into a makeshift auditorium for the monthly board meeting. Folding chairs arranged in neat rows faced a long table where the 5 elected board members sat with Morrison positioned at the center like a king holding court. The local cable access camera operator adjusted his equipment while parents, teachers, and community members filed in for what they expected to be a routine administrative presentation. I sat in the back row, just another concerned community member attending a public meeting. Morrison hadn't noticed me yet. His attention was focused on his notes and the laptop containing his fabricated credentials. He looked nervous but determined, probably convincing himself that his updated documentation would put any questions about his qualifications to rest. The board president called the meeting to order and announced that Principal Morrison would be presenting his annual review and vision for the coming academic year. Morrison rose from his seat with forced confidence, adjusting his tie as he approached the podium. He began with statistics about test scores and graduation rates, carefully framing every metric to make his leadership appear successful. I watched him lie with the same smooth confidence he'd shown when destroying my career, presenting half-truths and manipulated data as evidence of his administrative brilliance. Then he transitioned to his qualifications and continuing education efforts. Morrison clicked through PowerPoint slides displaying his credentials, including several new certifications and training programs I recognized from the Degree Mill correspondence. He spoke eloquently about his commitment to academic excellence and his extensive background in educational leadership. The board members nodded approvingly. Parents in the audience looked impressed by their principal's impressive qualifications. If they only knew they were applauding an elaborate fraud. Morrison concluded his presentation and asked for questions. The board president complimented his work and asked if anyone in the audience had comments or concerns. I raised my hand. Morrison's eyes found me in the back row, and I watched his face go pale as recognition dawned. The confident smile faltered for just a moment before he composed himself, probably assuming I was there to make some desperate complaint about my termination that would only make me look vindictive and unstable. He had no idea what was coming. I stood slowly, holding a manila folder containing documentation that would end his career. The room fell silent as I walked down the center aisle toward the podium, my footsteps echoing in the suddenly tense atmosphere. Morrison watched me approach with growing alarm, his confident facade cracking as he realized this wasn't going to be a simple complaint about his personnel decisions. The board members looked confused by the tension suddenly filling the room. Parents and teachers shifted in their seats, sensing drama but not understanding its source. I reached the podium and set my folder on the lectern, facing the board table where Morrison sat frozen in his chair. When I spoke, my voice carried clearly through the silent room, each word carefully measured for maximum impact. I began by thanking the board for the opportunity to address them about a matter of critical importance to the district's integrity and the safety of students. I introduced myself as a recently terminated teacher with 15 years of exemplary service and explained that I'd uncovered evidence of serious fraud that the board needed to address immediately. Morrison tried to interrupt, claiming this was a personal vendetta related to my termination, but the board president gestured for him to remain silent while I presented my information. I opened my folder and began systematically destroying Morrison's fabricated credentials. I presented screenshots of his correspondence with professional education services, including price lists for various fake degrees and instructions on how to make fraudulent diplomas appear legitimate. I showed documentation proving that Westfield University was a degree mill with no actual faculty, no physical campus, and no legitimate accreditation. The room buzzed with shocked murmurs as I detailed how Morrison had purchased his PhD, his master's degree, and several of the continuing education certificates he just presented to the board. I provided contact information for the Nevada mailbox service that served as Westfield's campus, and phone numbers that led to answering services rather than university departments. Morrison's face had gone from pale to ashen gray as I methodically dismantled every credential he'd used to obtain his position. Board members were frantically taking notes, their expressions shifting from confusion to horror as they realized the scope of the fraud. But I wasn't finished. I presented evidence of Morrison's inflated salary based on his fraudulent qualifications, documenting hundreds of thousands of dollars in compensation he'd received under false pretenses. I showed how his lack of legitimate training had contributed to declining test scores and teacher morale problems that had been blamed on subordinates like myself. Then I delivered the personal blow that made this about more than just financial fraud. I documented how Morrison had systematically targeted competent teachers who might question his methods or expose his incompetence. I showed how my own termination had been orchestrated through fabricated complaints and manipulated performance data, part of a pattern of retaliation against anyone who posed a threat to his fraudulent authority. The cable access camera captured every moment as Morrison's career imploded in real time. His expensive suit couldn't hide the sweat stains spreading under his arms. His hands shook as he fumbled with his papers, desperately trying to formulate some response that might salvage the situation. The board president asked Morrison directly if the allegations were true, if his degrees were fraudulent, if he'd been operating under false credentials for the past 18 months. Morrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. His silence was more damning than any confession could have been. I concluded my presentation by noting that I'd already provided copies of all documentation to the State Attorney General's office, the Department of Education's Fraud Investigation Unit, and several local journalists who would be following up on the story. The board wouldn't be able to quietly handle this situation internally. Morrison's fraud was about to become very public knowledge. As I returned to my seat, the room erupted in chaos. Parents demanded answers. Teachers who'd been afraid to speak against Morrison suddenly found their voices. Board members called for an immediate executive session to discuss their legal obligations and liability. Morrison sat in his chair like a statue, staring at the table in front of him as his world collapsed around him. The same man who'd handed me a termination letter with cold satisfaction just weeks ago now looked like he might vomit or faint. The board president called for a recess while they consulted with the district's legal counsel. As people filed out of the room in animated conversation, I remained in my seat, watching Morrison gather his papers with trembling hands. He finally looked up and met my eyes across the room. In that moment, he understood exactly what had happened. The anonymous inquiries, the paranoia-inducing notes, the psychological pressure he'd been feeling, it had all been orchestrated by the teacher he'd carelessly destroyed, the man he'd assumed would disappear quietly into professional oblivion. I nodded once, a small acknowledgement that justice had been served, then stood and walked out of the building where I'd dedicated 15 years of my life. The parking lot was buzzing with clusters of parents and teachers discussing what they'd just witnessed. Several people approached me to offer support and apologies for not standing up when Morrison had targeted me. Sarah Chen wrapped me in a fierce hug and whispered that she'd known something was wrong with Morrison from the beginning. But the most satisfying moment came when I reached my car and saw Morrison emerging from the building through a side exit, probably trying to avoid the crowd of angry parents waiting by the main entrance. He walked slowly to his Lexus, shoulders slumped in defeat, looking like a man who'd just received his own career death sentence. As he drove away, I realized I felt no pity for him. He'd gambled his entire career on a lie, used that lie to destroy other people's livelihoods, and shown no remorse for the damage he'd caused. The consequences he was about to face were entirely of his own making. I drove home through familiar suburban streets, but everything looked different now. The weight of rage and helplessness that had pressed down on me for weeks was gone, replaced by a calm satisfaction that felt like finally exhaling after holding my breath underwater. My phone started buzzing with calls from reporters before I even reached my house. The story was already spreading through social media, picked up by education blogs and local news websites. Morrison's fraud would be front-page news by morning, a cautionary tale about the dangers of inadequate background checks and the corruption that could flourish when credentials went unverified. More importantly, his targeting of competent teachers to cover his own inadequacies would be exposed. Other educators who'd suffered under his incompetent leadership would finally have their vindication. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into my home office, the same room where I'd planned Morrison's downfall. The revenge had been more satisfying than I dared hope. Not just because Morrison had been exposed, but because the exposure had been so complete, so public, and so devastating. Within 24 hours, Morrison had resigned in disgrace. Within a week, criminal charges were filed for fraud and theft of public funds. Within a month, the school district had offered me reinstatement with a formal apology and back pay. But I'd already accepted a position at a private school across town, one that appreciated teachers with integrity and experience over administrators with impressive-looking credentials of questionable authenticity. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if Morrison understands the elegant symmetry of what happened to him. He'd used lies and manipulation to destroy my career, so I'd use truth and evidence to destroy his. He'd leveraged his fraudulent authority to make me feel helpless and humiliated, so I'd orchestrated his humiliation in front of everyone who trusted him. The man who'd fired me for poor performance had been exposed as a fraud who'd never earned the right to judge anyone's competence. Justice, served cold and perfectly calculated, had never tasted so sweet. In the end, Morrison learned what I'd always taught my students. Actions have consequences, truth has power, and integrity matters more than credentials. Too bad for him that he learned those lessons too late to save his career, his reputation, or his freedom. I was a teacher fired for poor performance until I exposed the principal's degree mill. Now I'm a teacher who proved that sometimes the best education happens outside the classroom, in the real world where fraud meets justice and lies meet their match. The lesson was over. Class dismissed.